I'm so sorry, sister.
Stop reminding me, brother.
She should have put more energy into her reply, but Elishnish was too dejected to care about much. She shifted her weight as they waited on the wall for their deliveries to be readied and loaded. Though she wasn't paying much attention to the goings-on around the trading outpost, everything that she sensed around her was still entering her memory, and thus associations started to be made between the collective experiences of her life which could be recalled with perfect clarity. The dwarves were loading the sledges with what appeared to be bulky and durable articles, food and furniture and other similar goods. In addition, each sledge had a dozen or so dwarf passengers. When roughly 6 of these sledges had been fully loaded, the undead horses drawing them would head off as a small caravan following the route to Fiobarkana. Even with the heavy snowfall, there seemed to be enough traffic going back and forth to establish a clear trail. The more fragile and valuable-looking items had been separated from the rest of the belongings, being transported and placed into infinite haversacks after being recorded on cargo manifests by vampire brides. Having their cargo processed, each dwarf was then handed a slip of paper and directed to wait for the next caravan. When enough of the magical bags had been filled, a dragon was sent off with them. As a whole, the dwarves appeared to be doing practically none of the real work on the surface. For what reason are they helping the dwarves? Elishnish wondered. There seems to be little benefit to all this. Has some great tribute been delivered for all this assistance being provided? I'm not exactly sure how things went on the dwarves' end, Hegemol said, but what it amounts to is the initiation of cordial diplomatic relations and trade. Though the relationship just started recently, I believe that the objective of the Sorceress Kingdom is to have the Dwarf Kingdom become their allies. Allies? Elishnish scoffed at the notion. Don't you mean tributaries? These dwarves are pitifully weak and offer no benefits aside from gleaning the fruits of their productivity. I assume this to be the case. At least, between the dwarves and we frost dragons with our Quagoa slaves, we would have made far superior allies. It's a matter of perspective, I suppose, Hegemol replied. Lady Shiltir is not the only powerful being in the Sorceress Kingdom, and you've personally experienced her ire. We are all weak, in their eyes. The Sorcerer King apparently chose the dwarves because he recognized them for that very productivity you mentioned. So father died because the dwarves are better crafters? Elishnish snorted. Maybe you had better learn some trade skills, dear brother. Actually, sister, about that, I was wondering if you could teach me. I'm not a smith, Hegemil. To become a bard, I mean. I thought more on what our parents would say, about strength and pursuing the paths to power. With the forces of the Sorceress Kingdom being as strong as they are, trying to stand out on those terms seems rather futile, so I thought, why not become something useful? You really need to stop with that cringing attitude of yours, brother. Elishnish narrowed her eyes at him in annoyance. Start acting like a proper dragon, you're not some sort of pet. Hegemol went into a fit of coughing, and the people below scattered away from flecks of spittle that rained down from above. Several dwarves shouted up angrily at him. Sorry, he apologized sheepishly, deaf to her words. Elishnish rolled her eyes and eyed the pavilion where the bags were being loaded. There still weren't enough yet. A new caravan of sledges departed, just as another arrived. It's not just that, sister, Hegemol resumed speaking. Bards are masters of knowledge and lore, aren't they? We are not so different, you and I. I cannot believe I just heard that, Elishnish sneered. Just because we both love to read and learn about the world does not make us alike. We are not like these mortals with their lifespans that are but an insignificant drop in the great ocean of time, who must decide what they must be before the brief flicker of their lives vanishes. You have an eternity to become what you are to be, and an eternity to regret should you embark upon the wrong path. Didn't you just advise me to learn some trade skills? It was a joke, brother, she sighed. I am now speaking to you seriously. Then, why did you choose to be a bard? I did not choose, it is what I am. Elishnish was growing impatient with his fantastical silliness. How do you not understand this? Perhaps you've shut yourself in with those books for so long that you think you're a dwarf? Or perhaps a quagoa? I will be nice enough, in this case, to remind you that you are a dragon, brother. We do not grow the same way as those mortals, nor do we perceive and learn about the world the same way. Even the way we understand magic is not the same if what the books in Fiobarkana say on the subject are not just the ravings of a lunatic. I suppose those books on magic did not make much sense. Even Mother decided that they were only useful as a reference. The results are similar, yet their ways are entirely alien to us. Exactly. If you wish to grasp magic, then you must understand how we, as dragons, use it naturally. If you wish to fly your own course, then do so with the understanding that you are a dragon, not one of these puny mortal races. The knowledge that one acquires most certainly helps once you are on your way, but do not pursue these mortal paths. They aren't suited for our kind, and will only lead you to sorrow and regret. How do you know all this, sister? Heginmal said after a brief silence. Did Mother tell you? Some of it, Ilishnish admitted. But you should know by now that our kind is not one to be told. I know these things because I have already set out on my path, as has our mother. It is not something you'll truly realize until you do. All I can say is what I have already said. All that remains is up to you. All I am right now is incredibly confused. Good. At least those silly pretenses no longer have a hold on you. Why else do you think Father did not force you to become anything in all the years that you shut yourself away? Why does Mother still hold confidence in you despite your current, wretched state? It can take ages to become what you are to be, even when you are seeking it actively, and forcing your hand may ruin it forever. Fortunately, or unfortunately, we dragons just so happen to live for exactly that long. The fresh layer of snow built up on the wall near their feet crumbled away, and the heads of two vampire brides popped up. Ilishnish noted the magical bags over their shoulders as they finished scaling the wall. It seemed that there was finally enough to have them fly to Fiobarkana. She and Heginmal shook off the snow which had accumulated on them during the wait. The pair of vampire brides looked back and forth between them after finishing their task. What? Ilishnish looked down at the two undead in return. Can he fit? Ilishnish blinked. Excuse me? The broken ventilation shafts leading into the city have been repaired or blocked off entirely in the past few days, the vampire bride explained. Can this fat one fit into the main access shaft leading down from the trading outpost? Oh. Yes, he left through there the last time. It was a tight squeeze, though. As long as he can fit, it shouldn't be a problem, the vampire bride said. Why are you asking? Ilishnish asked. The surface outpost at Fiobarkana is in poor condition, the vampire bride answered. We just started using it and it almost collapsed entirely. The ongoing work to clear the rubble and survey the damage has just started, and the road above ground is clogged with traffic. We're having air freight delivered directly to the city level instead. So when we arrive, we immediately enter the city from the surface gate. But how does Heginmal get back out again if all the traffic is going down? Traffic is being directed manually for the time being. There are some things that need to be delivered outside before you return here as well. The ones at the office on that end will have more specific instructions when you arrive. The vampire brides looked up expectantly. Ilishnish supposed it was their cue to depart. Heginmal pushed himself off of the wall, angling down into the valley far below to pick up speed. She shook her head and followed suit. Have a safe journey. The vampire bride's voices followed her swooping descent. She caught up with Heginmal within a minute and, after weaving new enchantments over him, they quickly rose high above the mountain passes where the caravans made their way back and forth below. Fiobarkana, at their current speed, was roughly an hour away to the southwest, sitting at the crossroads between its three satellite cities. Together, they made up the entirety of the once prosperous dwarven kingdom in the Azalizia Mountains. Do they always say that, Heginmal? Her brother looked her way. Oh, you mean have a safe journey? Yes, they always say that when we depart. How peculiar, Ilishnish murmured. Why is that? Image, I guess? Something like advertising, or familiarity. I think the word Lady Schultier used was Brando, whatever that means. Brando-I don't get it. Well, I suppose it's sort of like this. What they're doing here is something new, so they want to make as good an impression as possible. All of the mannerisms, professional behavior, appearance. I believe those vampire brides will all have uniforms soon, the offices that they work in, just all one package that portrays the service as something that is warm, reliable and distinctly recognizable. You mean brand? B-brand? This is what you get for never leaving your room, Ilishnish said. You've read all the same things that I have, but you don't have the experience to make sense out of what you read. If you had simply explored the city and referenced all the things that you read about, you would have some understanding as well. Brand is something like you've described. It is image, a carefully cultivated reputation attached to whatever symbolism you've adopted. Like the sign of a store, or how dwarf crafters place their mark on finished tools and equipment, conveying a certain sense of quality and reliability for their goods to all who would see and use them.
Ah,
I see. I do recall reading something like that, but I never made all the connections.
I get it now, though.
No, you don't, Elishnish told him, and you won't until you actually see it for yourself. Even I don't understand the full meaning, only the hallmarks of it by sifting through the ruins of Fiobarkana. It is not too late, though. Now that the dwarves are returning, we will be able to experience this thing as it happens. As she spoke, Hegemol's flight path started to slowly veer from her own. Where are you going? Elishnish called after him. It's faster this way. We were instructed to follow the roads for this. I guess you weren't there. On top of helping deliver cargo back and forth, we're supposed to keep an eye out on the road for any sort of trouble and help out if we see it. If it's too much to handle, we're to use the message scrolls we've been provisioned with to inform the nearest office. Elishnish grudgingly altered her course to match Hegemol's. She didn't know what to think about helping out, though. A part of the brand they're trying to establish, then. She mused. Yes, something like that, Hegemol said. Service, hospitality, friendliness, that sort of thing. Does this hospitality and friendliness apply to frost giants? Frost giants? Hegemol's course wobbled about as he whipped his head around wildly, as if trying to look in all directions at once. Where? Stop panicking, brother, Elishnish snapped. We're far too high for them to do anything to us. Why did you even look up? We've passed by 3 of them so far. There's number 4. Crouching against the icy mountainside, within a stand of tall, snow-crowned trees, a large blue-skinned figure wearing a metal cap and a chain shirt over layers of hides observed the caravans making their way through the passes. Its only visible armament was an iron-tipped spear, roughly 9 meters in length, lying flat on the snow. It seemed so intent on observing the traffic below that it did not realize that it was being observed from above in return. I don't see anything. Hegemol continued to scan the terrain, but they had already long passed over the frost giant's position. Are we supposed to do anything about them? Elishnish asked. I don't know. Hegemol looked back up at her. We never received any instructions about that. What can we do anyway? They're frost giants. Kill them? Elishnish wasn't sure what the problem was. They're pretty easy to pick off when they're alone like that. You've killed frost giants before, sister? Pretty regularly. Once a month or so? Hegemol stared at her with his right eye incredulously. Even so, he finally said, I don't think we should. Are they going to cause any trouble? They won't, Elishnish told him. They're just scouts watching what's going on. Those undead horses. Soul Eaters. Really? Those are Soul Eaters. Elishnish peered down at the road. They were much smaller than she expected from what she had read of them. Anyways, there are 6 Soul Eaters per caravan and each of them is much stronger than I am. It would probably take a whole tribe of frost giants to take even one caravan down, at least if they want to capture everything mostly intact. Well, if they don't plan on doing anything, Hegemol reasoned, then I don't see why we should either. Hegemol's logic was sound. There was really no merit in doing anything. It was a pointless detour, especially if her kin no longer called the Azalizia range its home. Since the frost giants were no longer competitors, they were now someone else's problem. Let's begin our descent then, Elishnish said. Fiobarkana should be around the next mountain. They banked around the final ridge and discovered that Fiobarkana's trading outpost was most definitely not in the state that they had left it in. If not for the slow stream of traffic to the gates of the dwarven capital, Elishnish would have believed that she had somehow ended up in the wrong place entirely. The vampire bride informed them that it was in poor condition, but this was decidedly a gross understatement. The outpost, in reality a massive fortress that guarded the surface gates of the old dwarven capital far larger than the one over Fiojura, stood no longer. Whether an inevitability of the relentless march of time or resulting from the merciless assault of the elements, a large portion of the mountain face had been shed, taking most of the fortress with it. In the grey hours of the dawn, The imposing entryway to the capital lay oddly exposed to the open skies over a vast flow of broken stone that disappeared into the misty valleys below. Elishnish cast a pointed look over at her brother.
What?
Hejinmal said nervously.
I was thinking about how you were probably the pebble that set off this avalanche.
No matter how round I appear, I'm still just a dragon. Her brother refuted the assertion. Besides,
weren't you the last to leave?
And just what are you implying by that?
Nothing, dear sister.
The high mountain winds buffeted them along their descent, and they skimmed over the beginning of a long snarl of traffic on the mountain trail. Many of the dwarves in the sledges cried out and ducked their heads, but the Soul Eaters were unsatisfyingly unresponsive. In the gaping chasm where the fortress once stood, an impromptu bridge composed of iron lengths spanned the distance to the gate. There was nowhere for dragons to land but at the lip that remained before the access shaft, so, rather than being redirected to the city proper, they really had no choice but to go straight in. They circled over the gate until a vampire bride stopped the traffic long enough to create a space to land in. Hejinmal landed first, and Elishnish slipped into the tunnel after him. She did not release her enchantments, lest he cause a different sort of avalanche by losing strength and tumbling down the ramp. Somehow, she suspected that blame might be pinned on her, and she didn't feel like experiencing whatever would result from that. Elishnish was forced to stare at Heminjal's rump for over an hour while the traffic trickled down, deep into the mountain. If not for Hejinmal's rotund body, two-way traffic of the sledges and even other frost dragons was possible, so she felt particularly subject to scrutiny as her brother created additional delays. It was an unfamiliar and uncomfortable sensation, as dragons generally did not worry about such things as inconveniencing others or being in the way. Elishnish wondered if some sort of strange magic was being worked over her, or it was simply her awareness of the world around her expanding as her personal experiences did. They emerged from the shaft into the commercial quarter of Fiobarkana, and a vampire bride called out to them.
"This way," she said, waving a pale arm over her head.
They were guided to the old, half-collapsed remains of a merchant inn. Once a sturdy structure of solid stone and hardwood timber frames, the foraging of the quagga and the centuries since it last saw any maintenance had reduced it to a single floor. The tavern that occupied most of the main floor had been cleared of ruined furniture and scattered debris, the sturdy stone counter converted into a reception desk for the office while newly made shelves had been installed and filled with parcels. A pair of vampire brides retrieved the infinite haversacks from Elishnish and Hejinmal, placing them on the reception counter.
"There doesn't seem to be enough room to store everything," Hejinmal noted.
"Yes," one of the vampire brides let out a small sigh.
"Our deliveries are operating as scheduled, but the dwarves utilizing our service appear to have no schedule to speak of.
Since they have not picked up their parcels, we have filled the entire space that we initially thought would be suitable for our office." "They don't want their treasures?" Elishnish furrowed her brow. "Why would they bother sending parcels over if they don't plan on retrieving them?"
"The reason is not clear," the vampire bride replied.
"We've sent word of the delays but they only seem to get progressively worse. The queue of Soul Eaters outside is nearly a kilometer long, so we've made the recommendation to put deliveries from Fiobarkana on hold until whatever it is that's causing the problem is resolved."
Elishnish raised her head, stretching her neck to look out over the city street.
While the sledges continued to trickle in slowly, she could see the point further in where traffic had stalled entirely, clogging up the main thoroughfare and spilling into the side avenues and alleys. Distant shouts punctuated the air, bouncing off of the massive stone colonnades that spanned from the ceiling to the floor of the cavern. She strained her hearing to make out the dim echoes over the city, but could not piece together anything coherent.
"Does that mean we're on standby until there's room again?"
Hejinmal asked, and Elishnish lowered her head to return to the conversation. "Until either we negotiate more storage space," the vampire bride replied, "or whatever is causing the delays is resolved, operations are at a standstill."
"Oh, that's nice," Hejinmal brightened.
"Maybe we could get a bite to eat, dear sister. Did you have anything stashed away nearby?"
"I do," Elishnish said, "but you're not getting any.
You need to lose weight, dear brother."
"Eh?
Don't me. I have absolutely no desire to tail you forever." Elishnish looked around for a moment before turning to walk around the tavern towards an alley nearby. "Where are you going?" the vampire bride asked. Seeing what these dwarves are up to, Elishnish looked over the wall and back down at her. You said we're on hold for the time being, yes? Well, if you can find out what's going on, make sure you check back in an hour, just in case there are any new developments here. Elishnish didn't bother replying, turning the corner into an alley and disappearing from view. Rather than immediately altering her appearance, she found a good vantage from where she could quietly observe the slow build-up of dwarves arriving in the city. The various stone busts, portraits and statues that remained around the old royal palace provided her with a good initial reference for their appearance, but, with so many new subjects on hand, she could refine it into a more personalized look that would better fit in with their kind. While Elishnish seemed to have accurately estimated their height and stout stature, as well as most of their basic features, there were a few points on which she had clearly erred. Female dwarves, for instance, did not have such long beards as the one she had emulated from an iconic bust in the royal palace, thinking it an outward sign of prestige. There was no such frosty blue hair color either, so she would need to shorten the beard and alter the colors to match. Their complexion as a whole was far more rugged than she had estimated. With nearly all of them wearing dull traveling garb rather than the lighter, refined robes she was accustomed to using, she decided to simply fit in by using the same ubiquitous fashion as the masses. Well, maybe she spruced things up just a bit. It would not do to be looked down upon. Satisfied with her adjusted mental image, Elishnish wove her magic and a rather average-looking dwarf female with steely blonde hair and a short beard walked out of the alley shortly after. There were already hundreds of dwarves waiting in the streets, so the appearance of one more did not seem to draw any notice from anyone. Squeezing by several sledges, she stopped when she came upon a bored-looking female dwarf absently chewing on a piece of dried meat. "Do you know what's going on up ahead?" Elishnish asked. "This is getting to be quite the delay." She spoke in dwarvish tongue, fearing that using her native Draconic would inevitably give her away if she used the wrong words or the translation came out strangely. This happened once, when she had tried mixing in with a group of Quagga as a test for the magic. Hopefully, her speech appeared to be passable. The dwarf woman looked down at her from her seat at the edge of the freight bed, and her dangling legs stopped swinging. She gave her a pointed once-over which made Elishnish straighten nervously. "Fights have started at the gate into the residential quarter," the dwarf finally replied to her question. "It's what's come up the way, anyways." "Fights?" Elishnish frowned, "but we just got here." "You tell me," the dwarf snorted. "Finally come back after 2 centuries and you'd think things should be looking up. But nope, first things a half-dozen idiots bout to start a feud over who gets to move into their grandpappy's place." Fighting over territory already? That did not make much sense to Elishnish. She did not know how many dwarves there were, but if the abandoned and ruined satellite cities were any indicator, Fiobarkana was much larger than Fiodura. If the dwarf nation planned on reclaiming all of their cities, grinding to a halt in order to fight over the first sliver of territory that appeared before them was utterly foolish. Reasonable races would simply spread out over the area, and only compete for resources when there were none left. Just who is running things here? People sent by the council. Who it actually is, beats me, the woman smirked. Officials looked so proud too, telling us that we were coming back to start a new golden age. The only thing started is a giant mess. It can't be all that bad, Elishnish offered. They're probably just being s. She clamped her mouth shut. She was going to say stubborn, but dwarves were notoriously so. Saying such an obvious thing would have probably attracted suspicion. Her lips parted, and she let out her breath in a half. "Stupid? You bet," the woman appeared to have misread her. "You look like you're from some rich and influential clan. Maybe you could go up there and unstupid them for us so we can all get on with our lives." Elishnish dipped her head slightly to the woman and slipped away before any more misunderstandings could occur. Her blind sight still worked perfectly even while she appeared as a dwarf, and she navigated through the otherwise confusing snarl of sledges and bodies with minimal effort. The street grew more packed as she made her way forward, and she stopped beside a building when the shouting grew noticeably louder. A dwarf was standing on a stone bench along the wall, running his gaze over the throng. He held a long-handled hammer and a tall shield, with a dark suit of plate mail and helm to match. His visor was raised, grim expression somewhere between annoyance and wary watchfulness. "Is it getting worse?" Elishnish looked up at him. That's His gaze flickered over her as he responded to her voice.
"It might not be as bad as it seems, miss. Letting them stand there hurling insults at one another sure doesn't help though." "What about the council? Who did they send?"
"The cabinet secretary's men, tax thieves, if you ask me."
"Did they do something to start all this?"
"They've put themselves in charge of everything that every other councillor isn't." He grunted and resumed his watch over the surroundings. "That's why nothing works past this point. They're so used to managing desperate refugees for generations that they thought they could just do the same when it comes to moving back in. Now that the people have grown a spine over their ancestral holdings, these spineless officials are powerless. All they're good for is turning everything into a bureaucratic mess and blowing hot air."
"But there's so many waiting outside, and even more coming."
"Then it looks like we're going to have a lot of people sleeping wherever they are tonight." The man sighed and looked back down at her.
"Look, miss," he said,
"if your clan has any clout here, we'd all appreciate it if you'd help get things moving along." Elishnish bobbed her head and left the dwarf to his watch, working her way further into the crowd. Soon there were far fewer vehicles and far more bodies where the mass of curious onlookers observed the ongoing altercation. The expressions around her were varied, some were amused, others expectant. A sizable portion crossed their arms in grim silence with uncertain looks on their faces. The six-way shouting match continued between the dwarves in front of the gate, and a row of more expensively dressed ones, whom she assumed to be the cabinet secretary's men, attempted to intervene with exasperated expressions and no success.
"How long has this been going on for?"
Elishnish asked when she came near to the edge of the crowd. An elderly dwarf to the front turned at the sound of her voice, and his eyes widened in shock upon seeing her. "Oh," he said weakly, placing a grizzled hand over his chest. His mouth continued to work silently and she furrowed her brow at his reaction. The aged dwarf turned away. Why did these people keep reacting like this? She lightly brushed her stubby fingers through her hair to make sure she hadn't accidentally left her horns on her head or something. "Too long," another dwarf muttered to the side, gaze fixed to the continuing argument. "They need to just drag them off to the side and have them figure this out elsewhere." "Well, I guess that'd only help until the next group of louts comes in with conflicting claims."
"Then why don't they? There's plenty of free space in the city."
"Because it's the cabinet secretary's men," he said.
"If it was the commander,
he'd have hauled their asses off instantly. There's just too few soldiers now, though. What little we had in Fiobarkana's now split between keeping order between two cities." "You work for the commander?"
"Yep,
was my turn to get the missus and the kids moved in, now this." He motioned into the air at nothing in particular as the argument rose in volume again. "The councils served well enough in holding things together, I guess, but now that we're reclaiming our kingdom, what we need is a king. It's the king that all the families, all the clans, ultimately answer to, and the secretary of the king's cabinet won't be able to maintain a regency forever."
"But the royal house
vanished with the demon gods." "I know," he sighed. "That's the catch, ain't it?"
Elishnish shook her head.
Dwarves were silly beyond belief.
If they needed a ruler, then they should just have the strongest rule over them.
If anyone disputed that rule, they could just challenge it. As for the argument in front of her, it had a simple enough solution. By all appearances, each seemed to assert their precedence by listing off the lineage which connected them to their ancestor, followed by any achievements and feats by said lineage that might earn them the distinction of being considered the most prominent branch of the family. The louder, it seemed, the better, but Elishnish believed she would only need to be heard. "Can't you get this through your thick skull of yours, cousin? My pa's Raja, son of Thundin, son of Bomber, son of Malva, of Clan Cragbeard." Elishnish's voice sounded clearly over the street in front of the gatehouse. The six arguing dwarves, the cabinet secretary's officials, as well as nearly the entire crowd all at once turned their attention towards her. It took everything she had to not rear up and fly away beneath their sudden scrutiny.
"That's right,
miss," the dwarf she interrupted nodded. "You got something to add so we can finally get things sorted here?"
"I do," she replied.
"You are all descended from Thundin, son of Bomber, yes?" "Well, I got my doubts about some of these lizards," he said, and the others reacted poorly at his jab, "but let's just say that we are one way or another, 200 years ago," she said, During the siege of Fiobarkana by the demon gods, Thundin was an honored captain of the palace guard, charged with the defense of the eastern approaches. As one, the arguing dwarves straightened, chests and heads held high at the recounting of their grandfather's tale. "That's something we all know, miss," one of them said. "You got something else to break this stalemate?" On the second night of the demon god's assault, the king himself happened to come across Thundin, abandoning his post. He was attempting to flee the city, even as the civilians he was charged with protecting were still being evacuated. By royal decree, Thundin, son of Bomber, was stripped of his rank and title, his line exiled from the kingdom for his craven conduct in Fiobarkana's greatest hour of need. The soldiers at the gate to the residential quarter immediately snapped to attention, purposely striding forward to apprehend the 6 descendants of the cowardly guardsman. The air exploded into a cacophony of dwarf voices, an endless rain of angry curses and vehement insults that mercilessly pelted them. You bitch!" One of the dwarves pressed down to the street shouted, "How dare you! Our grandfather was a hero, a hero. He stood with our king, to defend the people. You and all of your kin will pay for this slander." The ire of the crowd was subdued somewhat. The soldiers still kept their hold on their captives, however, and the cabinet secretary's men looked towards her. "Is it not written?" Elishnish answered their collective, unspoken, question simply. The officials exchanged glances, and one of them retrieved a large sack from the ground nearby, placing it on a large table. From it, he pulled forth tome after tome, nearly all of them Elishnish immediately recognized as a part of her own hoard. She suppressed the urge to snatch them back as everyone awaited the answer. He finally brought out the tome in question that she had referenced, carefully flipping through it to find the record. All eyes were on the official, breaths held, as he silently mouthed the venerated dwarven histories before relaying his findings. "It's true. Every single detail is as she said. Just how?" The dwarf's words faded away as he looked back up towards the mysterious figure, but she was nowhere to be found. Elishnish dispelled her invisibility in an alley several blocks away, distancing herself from the crowded main streets of the city before she resumed her wanderings. She walked out onto a nearly empty avenue of the commercial quarter, strolling by the shops and various establishments that once served the ancient dwarf metropolis. As with the decrepit merchant inn where the vampire brides were posted, these buildings, too, were in a similar state of ruin. Dwarven architecture had a widespread reputation for its pragmatic and durable design, but even these structures could not withstand an era of neglect, especially with the Quago along having the opportunity to strip everything bare. Anything resembling valuable minerals, ores or metals had been gnawed away. Any obstructions to anything that they perceived as nourishment for their young had been broken down and cast aside. Extravagant pieces of furniture lay in pieces, torn apart for their metal supports and fastenings, while finely sculpted pieces of stonework had their decorative veins consumed. The quarter looked nothing more than having been subjected to an army of giant, stone-eating termites. Elishnish came upon a dwarf with his belongings piled about him, the soul eater which had delivered them disappearing around the corner. His grim gaze ran over the demolished storefront before him before settling on a broken signboard lying on cracked streets with a sigh. "Is something wrong?" she asked from a short distance behind him. "No, nothing like that. This." His voice slowed to a pause as he turned to reply, and he cleared his throat. "My family's place has seen demon gods, dragons, Quagoa and gods know what else. I'm just thankful that there's anything left at all." "It looks like a lot of work for just yourself." She looked over his lair again. "Demolished" was putting it lightly. The remains of the storefront was all that seemed to be left, with the rest collapsed into itself and caked over with decades of ice. "Humph, a little bit o' work ain't nothin'," he smirked, and his thick red beard waggled as he spoke. "Give me a bit o' time and she'll be looking good as new." He pulled the thick winter mittens off of his hands and brushed them off briefly. "Can't say I'll be doing much business till then." He extended a hand towards her, "but welcome to my shop. Flint Firebrand, this here's my family's old store." She stared at his proffered hand as he introduced himself. The dwarves had simple, nearly meaningless names, certainly nothing like rich draconic ones. Elishnish, on the other hand, had no name that she wished to share with anyone. The dwarf's expression of greeting faltered at her delay, so she quickly reached out and clasped his hand. "Thank you, Flint Firebrand. She fixed a smile on her face. My name is Shiver. Shiver? Flint raised a bushy eyebrow as he shook her hand. A stage name, then?
Yes, precisely, she nodded. I am a minstrel.
You don't say? Well, there ain't been much cause for song in the past few decades, but things are really turning round now. I take it you've come as one of the first to reclaim our history. Rather than seeking the histories, Ilishnish's lips turned up with the hint of a smile. I am more interested in witnessing the living history that is unfolding before our very eyes. It is a rare thing to be a part of such moments in time. I can always review the things of the past at my leisure. Ha, Flint roared, and Ilishnish barely caught herself from jumping up in surprise. Well spoken. I'm sure a fine lass like yourself will be welcome anywhere you go. I'll be keeping an eye out around the taverns for you. How long until you think they're open? She asked. As soon as they get the taps flowing, probably, he answered. The brewmaster's on top of his game when it comes to this sort of thing. Bunch of the Regency Council are, really. Now that they got the chance to show their stuff, they're really throwing themselves into it. So that's why it seems so much more orderly on this side, she murmured. What about the secretary of the king's cabinet? There's quite a chaotic scene in front of the residential quarter right now. The storekeeper scratched his beard and cocked his head slightly, but they were too far to make anything out beyond the general din floating over the city. Only the sounds of nearby restoration efforts could be clearly heard. Can't be helped, I suppose, he said at length. The secretary heads the ministers in the king's cabinet, but you can't truthfully say that it's the same government as the days before the demon gods. You can clearly see that they've been holding things together for all these years, but maybe it was out of sheer desperation that people followed their lead. Now, with the reclamation underway, there's probably a lot of pride and history and hot blood in the mix. Maybe they'll get a handle on it eventually, but that won't happen as long as things stay as they are. It won't become anything bad, will it? Ilishnish said worriedly. Probably not. The other parts of the Regency Council are running just fine. If anything, it's probably just all the excitement getting to everyone's heads. I get that people want to move in right the hell away, but seeing that they sent men to take a look around first, the council should have known what needed to be done first. They could have sorted things out in Fiobarkana while that all got done, but maybe it just all happened so fast that they had no time to think things through. I doubt it'll stay this way after they're getting a taste of this first batch. I see, Ilishnish said. Well, thank you for your time, Flint Firebrand. I should let you get back to your work. You're welcome at my shop any time, miss. Ilishnish bobbed her head as he smiled at her. Were dwarves even supposed to bob their heads? It seemed a common thing with humanoids, at least, and continued on her way. She zigzagged through the streets and avenues, witnessing many of the same scenes repeated over and again. Soul-eaters dropped off their passengers and cargo, while men and women went to work on restoring the old, broken lairs that belonged to their families before the fall of the city. Crossing through into the industrial quarter, she found that things were a bit different. Instead of various families arriving to each fix up the remains of their own ancestral properties, she saw that large teams of dwarves had been organized for a concerted effort to get each facility up and running again in turn. Just inside the gate, in front of a large warehouse, a finely dressed dwarf with a thick, overflowing beard braided in gold bands stood in front of a small group of his fellows. We got another urgent order for nails, Guildmaster, one of them spoke up over the ruckus. Brewmaster again. He wants to know when we're ready to get parts for furniture made as well. Ilishnish's steps slowed. According to the ancient texts in the capital, the Guildmaster was one of the prominent members of Dwarven society, a leading member of their ruling council. With the opportunity to finally get her first clear glimpse of a living dwarf lord, she decided that there was not much to them. This one was just a slightly wealthier-looking dwarf who directed those around him, similar to how Quagga lords behaved. Damn that idiot, the Guildmaster groused. Does he think we can start churning things out the second we move in? How's the Ironforge foundry looking? Still a long way, they've just finished making sure the area's cleaned up and ready for the overhaul. Well, less an overhaul and more a complete rebuild, those Quagga really left no nail uneaten. We got most of what we need together, but it'll be weeks yet until the furnaces are lit. We're setting up several dozen temporary smelters and forges in the meantime.
They're going as fast as they can then, the dwarf lord grunted.
We're gonna have to lean on Fiobarkana until we get at least 2 or 3 of these big jobs done.
The masons and carpenters, how are they doing out in the city?
The ones we have so far are already out and about doing what they can,
a different dwarf replied. All the shops are wrecked, we need more hands out here.
Which genius decided to try to be nice and fair to everyone again?
Hey,
that'd be the cabinet secretary's people, think they can play all the sides and ignore priorities. If the Forge Master was still around, he might have been able to knock some sense into them before all this. Well, no point whining about it. There anything else we can do to make things go faster?
What about transport?
Nothing to complain about there, all things considered. Everything's been precisely on schedule, well, until everything else clogged up. Now, all we can expect is that everything comes in order. I sent out a man to request that they expedite delivery of some riding lizards to help move all this debris away.
No idea how they'll do that,
though. The storm outside will freeze them solid in the passes. The discussion faded into the distance as Elishnish continued further into the quarter. With all of the dwarves' efforts focused on 1 or 2 complexes, the rest of the industrial quarter was eerily silent. The buildings, mostly centered around the metalworking industries of the city, had been the focus of the Quagga's predations. It wouldn't be wrong to say that the place had been chewed to the ground. The dwarf that spoke near the warehouse was right. Rather than restoring the old industrial buildings, they would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Having been born in the city, Elishnish personally witnessed its slow decline over the decades. To the dwarves, who had been away for centuries, however, it must have been quite the shock to see their old metropolis eaten to rubble. The next set of dwarves she encountered were all the way at the end of the avenue leading through the quarter. 3 soldiers stood guard at the gate to the royal quarter of the city. Their eyes followed her approach, but they did not speak until she came within 10 meters of the gate.
Halt,
the officer standing in the middle of the road ordered. By order of the Regency Council, no one's to enter the palace quarter without express permission. I've just come to take a look at my old home. A part of her wanted to say that to the soldiers at the gate, just to see how they reacted. Despite the often unpleasant mix of memories that came with the place, she had lived in the palace of Fiobarkana for nearly a century. It had been her lair for her entire life. The soldiers watched her as she stopped to stand before them, leaning on axes that stood up to their chests, but they did not move in any aggressive manner. Elishnish felt safe enough to speak from a distance. I'm just a minstrel, come to see with my own eyes this great homecoming, she said. To see the city, and what has happened since the time of the demon gods. The soldiers relaxed somewhat, eyeing her appraisingly. A minstrel, huh? The officer's voice lost its gruff tone. Well, it's good that you're here, but our orders stand, no one in or out of the quarter, without express permission, until further notice. It seemed that they were at an impasse. Up to this point, the dwarves seemed to be quite open with her for whatever reason, but the soldiers before her stood firm. It would be a simple matter to bypass them by going over the wall elsewhere. But the various interactions that had led her to this point left Elishnish with the feeling that witnessing the thoughts and reactions of the people were more important than just looking around. She reviewed events in her memory, seeking a way to fish out some sort of response to start a dialogue. Does it have anything to do with that smell? She wrinkled her nose as she spoke, and the soldiers frowned. Damn it, one of the men to the side said. We told those idiot officials that they needed those vents open to keep things aired out. But they only care about getting the temperature raised. We're dwarves, for crying out loud, a little bit of cold won't kill us while we wait for the furnaces to be rebuilt. What in the world is it? It was a battle, the officer said. Quagga parts and blood all over the Grand Promenade and all the statues and buildings along the way. The cabinet ministers keeled right over when they first saw it on the way to the palace. That sorcerer king did a hell of a number on those vermin, I can't even imagine what he did. Well, the city is getting warmer like the officials wanted, Elishnish noted, and the crowds coming in are getting right themselves, being pressed together in the streets and all. Are we going to have to deal with some incredible stench going forward?
No, that particular part you don't have to worry about, the officer replied. Some gentleman from the Sorceress Kingdom appeared and kindly offered to collect all the, chunks for us.
Said he could use the meat for his livestock or something. Should be long gone by now, but we're still dealing with all the stains. Gotta get things cleaned up before all the rich folks start making their way in. That's the reason why the quarter has been barred? For the most part, yeah, the officer admitted. Can't have some clan patriarch walking in and finding out that his family's mansion's got a fresh coat of Quagga paint, and can't have anyone else coming in before they get their house guards set up to protect their precious property. You're not part of some big clan head, are you? I swear I've seen you somewhere before. As I said, Ilishnish smiled disarmingly, I'm just a minstrel. We've certainly never met, I'm sure I would remember it. How long until the palace quarter is open for visitors again? I've heard so many things about it. Is everything they say true? Everything and more, the officer nodded. Well, minus the Quagga splattered all over the place. Should be open for all to see and pay their respects to the royal family in a couple of weeks or so. I see, she said. Well, there's much to see elsewhere still. I hear the brewmaster is working hard to get the taverns open soon too, so things should pick up before then. The soldiers brightened at the prospect she presented. Their stern expressions from when she had been called to stop had completely melted away. That's some welcome news, miss, the officer said, and the soldiers nodded. Can't wait to get that first mug in the capital, maybe we'll run into you sometime too. Ilishnish merely continued smiling and nodded before turning back the way she had come. She walked back through the industrial quarter, past the guildmaster and his men at the warehouse. She returned through the streets of the commercial quarter that were slowly filling with the build-up of incoming traffic. Entering an alley not far from the ruined building where the vampire brides were posted, Ilishnish slowed to a stop after sensing that a dwarf had slipped in behind her. Is there something I can do for you? She asked without turning around. The sound of iron-shod boots scraped over the stones as the figure stopped. Some time passed before the dwarf replied. Is it really you? Ilishnish frowned at the unexpected answer. She spun on her heel to face the source of the voice and found the elderly dwarf who had reacted so strangely before she ended the altercation at the gate to the residential quarter. His reaction now was no less pronounced, if anything, it was even more so. He took in her appearance and let out a choked sob, falling to his knees. By all of the gods, he said between shuddering breaths. Why? How? Ilishnish scowled down at the old dwarf. She hoped that no one would appear and cause problems over this odd sight. What do you mean by why? No, of course. I know, but... The dwarf lowered his head down over the pebbles in the alley. You've come for vengeance, for me. Please, my sons have done nothing wrong, neither have my grandsons. Take my soul if you want, but please have mercy on my line. Looking down at the shiny bald head and the wisps of dry, white hair, Ilishnish finally pieced together the mystery that accompanied her wanderings through Fiobarkana. Many disparate things had converged, threads through time that had intersected and twisted together to create this insignificant, yet remarkable, incident. Sheer coincidence in the eyes of many, perhaps, but Ilishnish knew, the world expressed its will in unfathomable ways, and fate was often delivered from an unexpected hand. Leave this place, Thundin, son of Bomber, she told him quietly. What's done is done. I cannot change the past for you, nor can I forgive you for it.